Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jo, I'm the Millennial Knitter. I'm speaking to you from London, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my first 6 months as a knitter. I started really knitting in October of last year, so October 2021, and I just thought it might be nice to have a little think back on my journey so far, why I started knitting, who taught me, what I found helpful. So if any of you are at the beginning of your knitting journey as well, you might be able to pick up a few tips or just share the same things that maybe I've struggled with. So I thought I'd start with why I started knitting. And I guess, like a lot of people, lockdown in the UK was really hard, and I have always been a really creative person. I'm lucky that my work let me work from home for most of the pandemic, panini, whatever we're calling it these days, and I started to feel just kind of itchy, like I needed something to be doing, that I couldn't just sit in front of the telly for another evening. As much as I love Netflix, I have a desire to feel a bit useful as well, so I thought, okay, finally I will retry the knitting. The other side of it for me is that I'm somebody who's dyspraxic, and you might not know anything about dyspraxia, but it's a bit like dyslexia, but it more affects your coordination and your ability to recognise patterns and things. So I had tried to learn to knit in the past. Bless my mum, tried with a lot of patience to teach me in the past because she's always been a knitter, and it just wouldn't click, just would not click in my brain. It was really frustrating, couldn't get on with it, like the idea of it, but just couldn't get on with it. And then this year in October, for a few reasons, I was spending some time at home with my mum and dad, and just decided, okay, we'll try again, we'll have another go. So I did, and weirdly, like magic, it just clicked. It's not easy, it's not something I found easy to pick up, but this time I could actually see the patterns, I could understand some of the movements, and I could get more than just a kind of ugly looking scarf. So that really gave me a bit of hope to want to continue. And as I've continued over the last 6 months, I've just gotten more and more joy from it. I'm somebody who, like I said, really likes to be creative. I bake, I do artwork, I've done other kind of creative hobbies in the past, and I loved the fact that knitting seemed to be something that was infinite, like there's infinite colours, there's infinite patterns, you can mix things up, you can change them, and you can make gifts for people. I think one of the other reasons I started in October was Christmas was looming into view, and I love making things for people, I like gifting things to people. And the two things just seemed to line up. I suddenly had this skill that I could use to actually make gifts for people, and I was super excited about that. And a lot of people got some hopefully reasonably okay knitted gifts from me for Christmas last year, and I think that really drove me forwards with it as well. Just having that reason to knit and just being able to feel really pleased that I could create something for people at a time that was still really difficult. Well, the main person who taught me to knit was Mum, my very long-suffering Mum, who has always been what I've discovered is an English style knitter. So Mum knits with the pin under her arm like this and knits like that, and she was able to teach me the basics of casting on, casting off, knitting and purling after a lot of tries. So I was able to get started with her, and then from there I guess it was YouTube. So a ton of really brilliant tutorials on YouTube would help me just embed it in my brain. I'll try and put into the show notes some of the basic ones that I found really helpful. I found Wool and the Gang had some really good ones, really simple techniques shown on kind of chunky yarn. And I think chunky yarn was key to my journey as a knitter this time as well. And she taught me on straight pins, straight needles. I started with some really chunky yarn this time as well, and I'm trying to think what my first project was. I think my first project may actually have been this guy here, which doesn't look like much, but a cushion cover. And I managed to knit a square fairly successfully in garter stitch, chunky, grey and cream, sewed it onto a cushion cover and was dead chuffed with what I'd managed to create. And I think because I used such chunky yarn, it didn't take very long, which meant it was super satisfying. And I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed it so much this time round. The satisfaction of being able to do something pretty quickly really works for my brain and made the whole process really enjoyable. I was going to have a look at I managed to actually make a list of all the different things that I had made during my first 6 months. So the list reads like this: red snood, mustard snood, blue hat, cushion cover, red and green cushion, child's beanie, adult beanie, snood, unicorn hat, stripy scarf, stripy texture jumper, hand warmers, pom-pom headband. And then we start to get into some slightly more complicated projects with the signage sweater, which was a We Are Knitters jumper that I'll talk about, grey flecked skirt that I made, moss stitch hat, I was really pleased with that one, yellow hairband, blue hat, green hand warmers, and cosy mock cardigan. And from that list, I reckon like 80% of them were gifts. And one of the things I really enjoyed and that I think definitely gave me the bug was the fact that I could make these gifts probably in a couple of evenings. I don't think they took very long. I made a bunch of chunky yarn snoods. I started off with some, maybe not the best quality yarn, but I didn't know that at the time. I went to my local Hobbycraft a number of times and purchased, got any of it? Stuff like this. So this is the Women's Institute chunky yarn. It's got a mixture of wool and acrylic in it. It's easy peasy to knit with and you can make something really fast, all of which massively appealed to me when I was first starting out. And the snoods, especially, a snood is much easier to knit than a scarf. It takes half the time. I think I rattled out 4 or 5 for Christmas presents and then was really chuffed with myself. I think one of the other things that I really enjoyed about knitting was you could see how much better you got, how quickly. So my stitches got neater, my ability to actually make something got faster, my ability to understand this weird knitting language that we all use, all these codes, suddenly become revealed to you and you're like, oh wow. And yet within all of that, I could still make loads of creative choices. So sometimes when you start a hobby, you have to get it right. And I am not good at getting it right or being perfect. I don't have a perfectionist bone in my body at all. And the nice thing about a lot of those first projects were it's always going to be a snood. If I've missed a stitch, still a snood. If I've made it a bit longer, still a snood. If I've made it a bit shorter, still a snood. And the person who's receiving it is going to have no idea that I've made mistakes or done something wrong or different from the pattern. They're just going to be really pleased that they've got a hand-knit Christmas thing of some description. So I think that made me really confident to just plough ahead and make a bunch of stuff, which in turn made me feel more and more confident to make a bunch more stuff. And I discovered that the thing about knitting that I loved was it feels like knitting is like recipes. So you do have to follow the basics. You've got to put your butter, flour, sugar, your knits and pearls and things in. But once you've done that, you can start adding cinnamon, or you can start changing the colours, or adding a row of garter stitch just because you fancy it, or, you know, make it a bit wider or a bit shorter or something. All those things are up for grabs and I really enjoyed that part of the gift knits that I was really pleased with was this quite long scarf that I made for my partner. Through making the scarf I also discovered something else I love about knitting, which is all sorts of bits and bobs that you can also buy. So this has a really cute little label on it which reads "Made with love and swear words" that I discovered from a fancy yarn shop not too far away from where I live. And that has given me the buying bug to buy cool things that I can also use connected to my knitting. I think that definitely helps. I really enjoyed this yarn. It was another one of the Hobbycraft Women's Institute ones because it's self-striping, so it does the stripes for itself. This was not a complicated knit. I think it's garter stitch again, but it was a finished project that I was really pleased with. So kind of graduated from snoods to scarves, and from there I started to make some longer term projects. So these ones took me a bit longer. So I made this guy, which is a very simple skirt. I based it on a free pattern online, which I think was a drops pattern that I adjusted slightly. So it's just got a simple rib at the top, straight stitch, and then garter stitch at the base. And I was really pleased with this because I managed to knit it in a week for my Christmas party. So I felt very pleased about that. And somebody at the party noticed it and said, "Oh wow, did you make that yourself?" And I did, and I felt very pleased with myself. So I think that definitely helped as well. From there, I made my first jumper, which I love but don't wear. So this jumper, I'll maybe insert some pictures of it, I made from another free pattern. I think I may have bitten off a bit more than I should have with this because it's called the Ombre Texture Sweater from Paintbox Yarns. And basically it's a whole bunch of different stitches. So I think it's got basket weave, moss stitch, Irish moss stitch, and I chose to use a stripy yarn, so it's also got stripes in it. And I also discovered something about myself, which is I'm very impatient, so I have knit this probably 2 inches too short. So I love the idea of it, but I don't really wear it because it is slightly too short. It did teach me a ton of different stitches, which was really fun, and gave me the confidence to decide, okay, I've knit something that is a garment, it could be worn by a human person. I've knit an actual jumper that resembles a jumper, could be worn, I have worn it, and now I'm going to treat myself to fancy yarn. I decided, yeah, basically I had to knit my way through something not too expensive before I would splurge on fancy yarn. So I splurged on fancy yarn, and if you've watched any of my other videos you'll have already seen this guy, but I splurged on my fancy yarn and I bought the kit from We Are Knitters to make the signage sweater, which I love. And the kit was brilliant because it came with some really nice bamboo needles. At this point I was still knitting on straight needles, and these were, probably unsurprisingly, quite a significant difference from these not very pleasant to knit with plastic ones to, I think these are bamboo 8mm needles. And the difference in how it felt to knit was wild. It felt so much nicer to knit with these than it did with those plastic ones. I had no idea before. As a brand new knitter, you just don't know that the tools do actually make a difference, and they do. I'll talk a little bit more about my transition from straight needles to circular needles as well. But yeah, I then decided to go for the signage sweater, mostly because I completely fell in love with this yarn, which is the Colorado in Petit wool, and I wanted the jumper to all be in Colorado but couldn't afford it because that yarn is even more expensive than the usual yarn. So I thought, well, if I get the signage sweater, then it's just one ball of the Colorado and I can build that into the rest of the jumper. So made the jumper and had it made for Christmas, which I was really pleased about. So in those first couple of months of knitting, I'd gone from snoods to an actual jumper. Chunky yarn again, massively the win, because you just make progress so quickly. Is this jumper perfect? No. Do I love it? Yes. The wool is gorgeous. It feels really lovely. It is a bit splitty to knit with, but I didn't even know that was a thing back when I started. So that's kind of some of the progress I made. Continuing on progress, the things I've made since then, I've also made tried to make the cozy mock neck sweater from Well Loved Knits, and made it too small because I didn't check my gauge. So decided to be brave and steeped it, turned it into a cardigan, which I love, which is in this lovely Drops Andes wool, which I've discovered it's not quite a dupe for the We Are Knitters, but it's a very good substitute. It's not a dupe because this is twisted and that's more single ply, but this I actually think is as good. So made this lovely cardigan, which I do wear quite a lot. Discovered steeking, which was exhilarating and fun. So yeah, in month 4 or something, I went from doing intarsia, which is quite a weird technique, moss stitch and textures, and then steeking. So I think I've embraced the challenges of knitting fairly rapidly. And then my latest finished one, which I'll talk more about in my next podcast, I don't want to talk about it too much here, is this gorgeous t-shirt that I've made with lace. So I thought it might just be nice for those of you starting out on your knitting journey to see that, look, you could go from very basic garter stitch scarf to lace t-shirt in a lot less time than I thought I would. So 6 months or so from that to here, which I don't think is too bad going. What has helped me as a newbie knitter? Well, I've talked about a couple of those things, but YouTube massively. I've got a bunch of YouTubers that I follow, and just hearing them talk, their enthusiasm, but also their pattern recommendations. When you first start looking for patterns, it's totally overwhelming. There is so much out there and it's really hard to tell what's good. And if you start out as a knitter and you try a pattern and you get really confused, you don't know if it's you, if it's the pattern, if it's a bit of both. So having some YouTube recommendations really helped me. People that I really love to follow are, I've been following Well Loved Knits, really like hers. I talked about her cozy mock neck sweater, which I was watching. Typical Bliss, I really enjoy her videos. She kind of, I think, got famous with some recreation jumpers and cardigans and things, so I liked watching some of those, and I just like her chatty vlogs now. And one of my absolute stars has been the Make Good podcast. It's this brilliant podcast by 2 women over in America. I've completely binged every episode. I think they're on like episode 57, and I've binged them all in about 2 months. And they talk in the most clear, friendly, jolly way about all different kinds of things to do with knitting. They explain techniques really brilliantly. I listened to it in the car when I was doing a lot of driving, and it just gave me that extra level of confidence to understand some things about knitting when I came back to them, when I saw them, to go, oh yeah, that's that thing they talked about, that's intarsia, or that's what steeking is, or those kind of things. So I would definitely say if you're starting out, just fill up the things you're listening to and watching with knitting content, and it will sink in. You won't think it has, but it will sink in, and you'll see something in a pattern, you'll go, oh yeah, it's that thing they were talking about. And then maybe you can look up a little YouTube tutorial. As I said, really found YouTube helpful for basic tutorials. One of the things I challenged myself to do in the last month or so was to knit a pair of socks, and on the recommendation of the Make Good podcast guys, actually picked the one sock pattern by, I think it's Kate Atherty, maybe, I'll double check. And there's a series of YouTube tutorials that go along with it, which is brilliant, because when you're trying to turn a heel, you can't do that without somebody showing you how to do it. And at least on YouTube you can watch it 100 times rather than really annoy your mum getting her to explain it to you 1,000,000 times. So that was really helpful. I think the other thing that really helped was chunky yarn. Actually having like access, and okay, I've been really lucky that I could afford to buy some of this We Are Knitted stuff. Access to chunky yarn made the whole process go really quickly, so I could knit a snood in a couple of evenings, or an evening even, and feel really pleased with myself, and that made me more excited to try something new. I'm now, I think like a lot of knitters seem to do, transitioning over to smaller yarn now that I kind of can see the stitches and can understand what I'm doing. If you start on chunky yarn, you can actually see things much more clearly, you can see where you've made a mistake, you make things a lot faster, the progress is much quicker. So I would massively recommend start with something chunky. It doesn't have to be this super high quality stuff, but it does help. It does help to have something of the kind of higher quality, I think. And similarly to the chunky yarn, just having quick projects to start with. Gift knit hats, not scarves, hats, snoods, wrist warmers, hand warmers, brilliant. You can get a pair of hand warmers done in an evening easily, even if you're a beginner knitter. And that's a lovely one as well, because then you think, well, that's another Christmas present in my box ready. The other thing that I've been exploring a lot more in the last couple of months is Ravelry, which is amazing. When I started, I thought it was just a pattern, like encyclopedia of patterns, but it's so brilliant. I would definitely say listen to a YouTuber talk about it in more detail than me, but you can filter by everything you can think of. Every yarn you can possibly find is on there, alongside projects that people have made with that yarn, which is amazing. You can see projects that people have made based on a pattern, so you can see knit in real life what that pattern actually looks like. You can search by everything imaginable, and I think I've barely scratched the surface of it, but get yourself on Ravelry, it is so helpful. And then I think the other thing I was going to talk about a little bit was just my change of tools. So partly inspired, I sound like a massive fangirl, partly inspired by the Make Good podcast guys, I decided to transition over from straight needles to circular needles. And quite a few different resources online said you really should transition over to circular needles. It will help you, you will knit faster, it will be easier, all of that kind of stuff. And for a while I thought, well, no, it can't be. How can it be easier? Because I had gotten used to knitting like this, tucked under one arm, like this, which I think is English knitting, a particular type of English knitting that got quite comfortable for me. And everyone was saying, well, no, transition over to holding these funny little circular things in your hands. So what I didn't understand when I looked at it, I kept thinking, well, but how can you knit? You'd have to let go of the needles to knit. So if you knit this way, it doesn't matter if you let go of your hand here to move the yarn over, because you're holding the needle tucked under your arm. And I couldn't work out, well, what do you do if your needles are circular? And what I didn't understand until I had forced myself to do it is that you don't actually need to hold the needles, the yarn holds the needles. So it's a really weird thing to describe, but basically if you can force yourself to get onto circular needles, you will knit a lot faster, it will hurt you less probably, and you'll find a lot more patterns that are with circular needles. I also decided to go for a set of interchangeable needles, so you hold them like this, knit back and forth, and the thing that I learned through doing it was basically this needle, if you do need to let go to move the yarn over, flick it over or loop it, whichever way you do, it's just held by the yarn. It's held by the yarn there, and also the cable, this is a really long cable, the cable holds your stitches, so you don't have all the yarn hanging off one needle. It kind of sits in the middle, so it seems a lot less effortful to knit like this, and it seems faster. It also means that you do things with a lot less seams, so if you're knitting a jumper, you're knitting a tube rather than two flat pieces and having to sew them up. I didn't realise that that would be easier, but it is. And a lot of modern knitwear designs are designed knit in the round, so I would say definitely get yourself onto circular needles as soon as you can, because it will get easier. I would say I found it hard for probably 3 or 4 weeks to try and get onto these, and now I don't know if I could go back. Don't know if I could knit something on flats now, having gotten used to circulars so much so that when I'm knitting my socks, I'm knitting them on teeny tiny circulars and really enjoying that as well. I think alongside just moving over to circulars, just getting better tools, like these are quite a long way away from these guys in terms of their quality, so that has definitely made a difference. Again, I'd say have a look at some podcasts or some YouTube tutorials about types of needles. I'm really enjoying these wooden ones. Some people prefer metal tips, some people prefer bamboo. It's all to do, I think, with like the flexibility of the tip and various things like that, but I have to say I'm really enjoying these wooden ones. I think the quality of the tools is definitely something to start looking into after you've got a few projects under your belt. And I suppose the last thing that I would say about my knitting journey is just how excited I am about the next few months. I've got a lovely little yarn stash developing here. I've treated myself a couple of times to some new yarn, and as I'm getting more confident with knitting, I am more able to go, okay, this isn't the yarn that it says, but could I probably make something with it? Yeah. Can I change up the colours? Absolutely. Can I change up the yarn thickness? Probably, if I can still reach gauge. Will it just create something a bit different from the original? Yeah. Will I probably still like it? Definitely. So stick around. I'm going to try and do a podcast monthly and these videos weekly. I'd love it if you could subscribe or give me a like, and I'd love to hear from you about what your first 6 months of knitting were like, or even your first month of knitting if you're brand new. Thanks very much. Bye guys.